Hi, welcome to the Inventory Framework plugin. Some of you who are watching are probably quite deep into the system by now. This video is not a video for complete beginners or anybody who's considering buying the plugin. This is primarily explaining what the inventory system is, not the inventory system. This is primarily to explain how the equipment system inside of the inventory system works. So, for example, how does this backpack get created, and how does this skeletal mesh get attached to it, and so forth and so forth. A lot of this is already covered in the documentation, and there's also examples in the example project, but this is going to more or less go into the nitty-gritty things and explaining how things start and how they end. So, before I begin, there is a very common question that is, how do you get the spawned actor or the spawned static mesh? For example, here you can decide if you want a blueprint actor, a skeletal mesh, or a static mesh. And how do you access the spawned blueprint? And this is how you do it. You get the item that you want, you get its unique ID, you convert the identity number into string and then into name, and you pass it in here, and usually here you want the owner of the item. So usually it's the owner of the parent component. So like that, usually. But here you can then get the component or the attached actor. So before I start explaining how the equipment system works, these are the 7 primary bullet points that need to be kept in mind for what this equipment system is trying to do. So first is recursion. It has to be able to infinitely attach things onto each other, and so forth and so forth. It also needs skeletal, static, and blueprint support, and it needs to be able to keep doing recursion with mixed skeletal meshes, static meshes, and blueprint actors. It then needs multiplayer, and these 3 combined already makes the system very complicated. There's animation chaining. I'll get to that in a moment, but basically it is, for example, when I equip this, the player character is going to play an animation, and then the spawn static mesh, a skeleton mesh, will play an animation. So you saw there that the player played an animation, and it spawned that mannequin, and that mannequin played an animation. And that's animation chaining. It can't do any hard referencing. So it needs to use tags quite often. And one thing that not many people realize is components can end up having the same name for blueprint equipment. So if you spawn a gun and attach it to another gun, and there's a static mesh inside of that gun, the system can get very confused about which static mesh that you're trying to talk to inside of those 2 blueprints. And this can lead to crashes, it can lead to odd replication behavior, and in general, it's not a very good time, which is why down here, components are being actively renamed, but basically they're just getting random numbers added to the end. And then for the last part is it needs to be able to support the preview actor. So that is a lot of requirements that it needs. But where all of this begins is if we go into, I believe it is equipment. It all begins on these 2 delegates. This is primarily so you can decide how the equipment system works, or inject some of your own code or modify how it works in general. But generally, I've already done all the heavy lifting so it replicates properly. So generally here, all it's doing is it's getting the equipment driver and spawning it and calling the equipped, and then doing the same basically for all the children items. So in this example, it would be the backpack and then the gun that's inside of it. And I'll explain in a moment why the gun is a skeletal mesh. That is for demonstration purposes in a moment. Then there's another event for when you equip an item and so forth. But in general, what is happening is the driver gets created. So if we go into the item driver equipment, there's two functions. There's the unequipped and the equipped. And what is happening is basically it's clearing some of this. It's then getting the item object, so the one that you're interacting with in here. It begins by filtering out the trigger filters. So you may have noticed here that there's a trigger filter, and in the data asset there is also these trigger filters, and that's basically to filter out which equipment information do you want. So what animation do you want? What are you trying to attach to where are you trying to attach it, and so forth. And it finds the correct one, it loads the animation, and so forth, basically preventing any hard references inside of here. So it needs to load the soft references. So here is where the equipment system starts getting a lot more complicated. Because we need to do animation chaining, you can't just call play animation multiple times, and you can't do recursive play animation. Whenever you call this node, it's going to cancel out, or I believe it either cancels out the previous play animation call, or it ignores the second one. It does one or the other, I believe. But what I do know is that you can't do recursive play animation or call play animation while it's already playing another one. So the point of this is to create a bunch of objects that will then play, call this function play animation, and have objects that are listening to notifying names. So you can see in here, if I look at wait for notify, there's actually two things that are happening here. So this is the holster animation that you saw the player do, and this is the animation that you saw the quote-unquote gun mannequin did. I don't have any example skeletal meshes inside of the example project because I'm not a very good artist, and I don't have any animation. I'm not also good at making animations for skeletal meshes, so I'm just using the mannequin as an example. You can see here that it's waiting for a notify equip item, and if we look here in the equip animation, there's an animation montage notify called equip item, and you can see around here in game is when that mannequin is getting spawned and the animation is playing. You can also see here play animation on mesh with tag. So because this is waiting for an event, the mesh might not exist by the time that this one begins. So it first listens to this, it then spawns this one spawns the mesh, and then this one just plays an animation after this happens. And the order is when the notify happens, this sequence node, it sends off the it spawns the mesh, and then after, then it calls execute equipment information for any mesh that is waiting for a notify. And that's how the animation chaining basically occurs. But you may also be asking, how is this tag assigned? Well, in this example, we are creating the skeletal mesh inside of the data asset. So in C++, if you create a reference to use skeletal mesh component, you will get this dropdown, and it's basically giving you the option of what kind of skeletal mesh component you want to create. But I think everybody will be using this one. And the reason why I have it set up like this is because you have access to everything. You have access to material overrides and transform and so forth. And you also have access to the tags. So here you can dictate the tag. Here I'm saying add item mesh to the component tags, and I'm then having the animation play on the mesh with this tag. And since the one before this one spawned this skeletal mesh component, then this equip information will be able to find the component, the skeletal mesh component. So I also mentioned here during the sequence that it spawns the component and creates it and then plays the animation, but I didn't explain how it creates the component. There's a function, let me see. So before it spawns anything, it attempts to find it, because there's also the option to hide the item, and there's also an option to reattach it to a different location. So for example, a gun, you might holster it and you want to put it into a gun holster or something like that. But in this case, the found is false, so it now tries to create the mesh. So here we go into equip item, and the primary issue with multiplayer and components having the same name and so forth is you need some kind of manager to make sure that items are attached in the correct order. So I may have mentioned here, yes, here. So I mentioned here in the documentation notes for optimal multiplayer experience. The way Unreal handles replication for attached actors is not the most elegant. When another player becomes relevant for another client, not all attached actors will get replicated within the same frame, and they might not replicate in the order that you want them to. So if you have a backpack that has a gun on it and that gun has a sight on it, you have no idea if it's going to replicate in the order that you want. It might, for one client, replicate the sight, then the backpack, then the gun. And for another client, it might replicate the backpack, the sight, then the gun, or in some other random order. And what the equipment manager basically does is ensures that everything is attached correctly in the correct order, but it cannot make sure, it can't modify how the engine replicates it, which is why I generally recommend that you use static and skeletal meshes, because the engine actually replicates meshes in the correct order. And everything is also replicated within the same frame. So in general, if you're doing multiplayer, I recommend you steer away from blueprints and try to use skeletal and static meshes as much as possible. But if you're doing single player, this doesn't really matter for you. But for multiplayer, I have to make some sort of system that make sure everything is replicated and attached in the correct order. And that's where the equipment manager comes in. And you are not able to attach it to... you can attach it like this, but it is recommended that you do not do this because there's a few prerequisites that need to be set up, like the actor seat and so forth. But here you can generally see that when this equip item function is called, it is creating the equipment manager and attaching it to the actor, and it's attaching it through this target. And then this equip item function is called, and it calls one of these three functions. So add blueprint, add skeletal, or add static equipment. And then it has a rep notify and a multicast. The problem with rep notifies is they kind of just happen whenever they feel like it, in a way. They basically just happen when there's available bandwidth, and it seems they have lower priority than RPCs. So, at least from my testing, it seems that if you modify a rep notify, if I look here, for example here, I'm modifying this rep notify, and then I'm calling this RPC, but the RPC happens before the onRep function happens. And I really need this to be replicated before the sequence node calls the next one, because the equipment needs to be spawned for other clients before we attempt to play an animation on said equipment. Otherwise, you're trying to play an animation on equipment that doesn't exist, and thus the animation will not work. So, but in general, this rep notify is primarily so when you have another client connect, or maybe you become relevant to another client, then this triggers and ensures everything gets attached in the correct order. But this is primarily so when you equip an item while you're relevant to another client, that it then executes immediately, which is what we need. We can't rely on this being fast enough, or it happening within some server frame and then getting the right packet or something like that, like here, praying that the rep notify happens fast enough. We can't really rely on it. So that's a brief explanation of how the equipment system works. There's a few more caveats to things. For example, when the equipment is created, it adds a tag with its unique ID. And that is how the get component by tag is working. It's going through basically everything until it finds the tag. But in general, you can also use this for anything else. There's a reason why this is not just an integer and you just pass in the unique ID for this. It's also, you can use this for just any tag that you want. So if you are using tags in your project and you are probably naming your things correctly. So for example, in the gun, that gun might be named the M4A1 or the AK-47 or something, and you might already be naming things that way. Then you could use this a bit more optimally in that way. But in general, I suggest that you get the component by the tag. I hope this helped answer some more questions about how the equipment system works, and hopefully the documentation will answer the rest of your questions. But to summarize, I have basically tried to solve as many different workflows and fit into as many different workflows and processes as possible. There was an astonishing amount of different ways to do equipment system, and it was very daunting to try and solve all of them in one go. This system isn't perfect, but in all of the features that people need, this solves a lot of problems that many people have for many equipment systems. And it tries to handle as much of it automatically, so you can just design it within the within the data assets. There are ways to make this more pleasant to work in, and that is where the Discord is primarily handy for. If you find any way of improving the system or improving the workflow, then feel free to let me know, and I'll try to update the equipment system. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.